There we go. Okay. So tonight, our speaker, Gayle Zydlewski, sorry, I hope I got that right. Zydlewski has Gayle has a BS in marine biology and biology, a master's in zoology, and a PhD in oceanography. She's worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Washington State University, and has been at the University of Maine since 2004. And you'll hear more about her research focus tonight, which includes fish ecology and the impacts of environmental conditions on fish behavior. But I will say that I promised the audience some discussion of why sturgeon jump. So I hope, Gayle, that you will speak to that. So without further ado, I will stop sharing. Gayle, you can share your screen and we will get underway.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right, I think I'm seeing some shaking heads.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for coming. My name is Gayle Zydlewski, as Caroline mentioned, and I am a professor at the University of Maine in the School of Marine Sciences. Another job that I have is I work and I direct the Maine Sea Grant program, if you're familiar with that. I'd love to talk with you about that another time. But I'm here to talk to you about sturgeon and some of the research I've been doing with many different colleagues along the way, some from the Department of Marine Resources and USGS, and a colleague from the School of Biology and Ecology. And you'll see this great picture of a sturgeon jumping right in front, right there in Androscoggin, on the Androscoggin, and that was taken by John Lichter. So it was, Caroline was saying that's pretty fantastic, and I will come around to talking about why people think sturgeon jump. But I will also just mention, as I have on the slide here, that there have been many people along the way. I started studying sturgeon in 2006 when I came to Maine. I came to Maine in 2004 and started studying sturgeon in 2006. I'm still intrigued by them, and there's a lot more to learn. So, but I'm happy to be here to share that with you. And really that comes to you through the support of all of the folks who have funded the research along the way, but also the many graduate students and undergraduate students and colleagues who are listed here. I probably have missed some, and many people who have helped volunteer to do the work that we do with sturgeon in Maine. So today, what I'd like to do is just start off by just kind of giving you an idea of what I'll cover over this next however many minutes, and feel free to stop me along the way, and I will get to jumping, but it'll be a little bit later. I'd love to start with just a history of sturgeon and humans, and then get into some of the questions. How much are they like salmon? Do they migrate? How big are they? Where do we find them in Maine? Why do they jump? What is their biggest threat, and how can we help? So I'm hoping to land on that and give you some ideas of what you might go forward with in terms of helping in this for this species. So in terms of a human history with Maine, I want to start just kind of giving a little bit of a perspective, because we always start by thinking about sturgeon from our own frame. So for me, I show you here my perspective. So working with a close colleague to better understand an endangered species is the way I went about starting this work. And we could take a little bit more of a perspective of looking back. So when they were more abundant and commercially fished, in backyards we might remember, for example, in Merry Meeting Bay. This is a picture from a while back in the 1900s of sturgeon being collected for harvest. However, I'd like to also challenge us to think a little bit further back still and think about the perspectives of the people who have stewarded the lands of Maine for thousands of years. The people of the Wabanaki Confederacy who continue stewarding these lands and the deep connections to the water and all those connected to it. Sturgeon were and are an integral piece of their spiritual connection to these lands. And I want to acknowledge that and the connection and use a place that might be familiar to some of you in Belfast. You may have crossed over the river we call Pissagasawakeg. The term is actually a place for sparing sturgeon by torchlight in the native language of that area. So sturgeon are part of the long history of these waters. And while I cannot begin to really appreciate that connection that the Wabanaki people have had for sturgeon, for example, in the Penobscot, I know for there was a clan of the Penobscot people that was named the Sturgeon Clan. So there was clearly a spiritual connection that I'd love to learn more about, and I just want to acknowledge that as well. So before I leave this slide, I also wanted to mention there are archaeological studies suggesting widespread sturgeon movement along the coast for 3,000 years at least. And I bring that up because there's some great work that's been done by Art Spies and David Hallowell in Maine that has shown, for example, this scoot, the little, the black picture in the bottom right corner is a piece that is was actually aged to be about 3,000 years old, collected from Winslow at the Sebasticook-Kennebec confluence. And you could go across the coast of Maine, and the places where you see these blue marks and little sturgeon are all locations where historical scoot collections have been made. So sturgeon are certainly a big piece of the history of the coast of Maine. But we can even go back further and think about sturgeon as a prehistoric fish. I know this is kind of a silly cartoon, but really when we think about sturgeon, we call them a fossil fish, and we call them that for a really good reason. If you go back and go through this very long history of the earth, about 200 plus million years ago is when the first sturgeon family was known to exist. And then if you move across the bottom of this slide, you can see pallid sturgeon existed 80 million years ago, and the dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago. So the sturgeon were around during those times, and it's just interesting to think about, the fact that they were here back then, and they're still persisting today. So this is just another way of looking at the evolution of fish over millions of years, and where these are the bony fish that the sturgeon kind of fall into the category of. So just jumping into sturgeon, here are some examples, actually a couple of my graduate students, the one that they're holding there is a very large short-nosed sturgeon, about the largest you'll find, that's really at the top end of their range. But what I want to point out to you on this are these plates along their back. They're actually very bony, and I've already used the word scoot because I use it all the time, but maybe you haven't heard it as much as I have. But these bony plates are called scoots, and they are they're characteristic for these fish. And you'll see, I'll show you multiple species, but they all have some example of these. And if you look at this picture in the lower right, this is a short-nosed sturgeon, and you can see kind of the plates, again, some more bony plates on the head of that fish. And I'm going to show you some other pictures that really kind of hit home this point of it being, sturgeon being a living fossil. So again, that's the picture that I just showed you in the previous slide. But this picture on the upper left is actually a picture taken from a fossil that was recovered and aged to be about 65 million years old. So from the upper Cretaceous period. And if you look at the head of that, I mean, look at how remarkably similar the patterns are of the bony plates on the head of that fossil relative to the ones that we're seeing in the fish, a picture that we took from a sturgeon from the Penobscot. And again, these are just some additional photos of those similar fossils taken from the Cretaceous period. So just to give you some idea of geographically around the globe where we find sturgeon. There are essentially 9 different regions that are shown in this map here, and they're just circled areas. But what you'll notice is they're all in the northern hemisphere. So if we actually flip this picture a little bit and we'll look down on it in a minute, but essentially we're talking about those in the Northwest Atlantic today. But when we look down on the Arctic Ocean, all of the rivers that are highlighted here are rivers that have sturgeon in them. There are multiple different species. These are just some examples. Whoops, sorry, of I'm going backwards here, if I can. This is a Kaluga sturgeon in Japan, a Chinese sturgeon, and a beluga sturgeon. So very large animals that are still persistent today, but in very rough shape. So this is just an example. There are 27 different species of sturgeon that are listed by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And 19 of those have experienced range retractions, and most of them are critically endangered. You'll see that paddlefish are shown here. They're actually in the same family, same order as sturgeon, so they sometimes group them together. But essentially what you see on all of these distributions, and it's just numbers of fish on the Y and then time going out to 2010 on each of those graphs, you just see a decline in every single species. And this is considered one of the most endangered fish species on the planet. Species groups, I should say, because as I mentioned, there's 27 of them alive or existent today. And I throw up a picture here of caviar, because caviar is the primary reason why sturgeon are captured and for commercial reasons to sell the caviar, because it's so prized. And it's still being, actually sturgeon are still poached today for the caviar and harvested in some places actually legally. But in most places, the caviar is very hard to come by. So population declines are not unique to sturgeon. You've probably seen this time and time again. Many of the species that we might talk about in the Northwest Atlantic and the Northeast Atlantic have seen dramatic declines in the recent couple of decades. What's interesting about sturgeon, among other things, is if we kind of analyze this chart a little bit, you'll see on the axis, the bottom axis, the x-axis, age at maturity. So what you see is that most sturgeon species don't even start getting to the age of being able to reproduce until they're 5 years old. So it takes a while for them to actually start reproducing. And even for some, this actually is a white sturgeon all the way on the right-hand side. It's on the west coast of the US. They're not mature until they're 25 years of age. And then if you look at this on the y-axis, how often they reproduce, they don't reproduce every year. So, if anything happens to an individual, if they don't get to be their spawning age, you won't have continued populations. So because of this, like late maturation, long time to actually spawn, this really puts them at risk for many species. Whereas some, for instance, alewives that you might be hearing about a lot right now, they have a much shorter life history and they spawn more frequently. So the two species that we'll be talking about tonight are the short-nosed sturgeon and the Atlantic sturgeon. And this is where they fall on this chart. But what you'll see is that, short-nosed sturgeon don't spawn every year. They spawn up to as far apart as every 5 years. And Atlantic sturgeon don't become mature till they're more than 15 years of age. So these are the 9 North American species of sturgeon that we could talk about. But the 2 that I'll talk about that are in Maine are the Atlantic and the short-nosed sturgeon. So this is a tale of two sturgeon of Maine. And I only put this up here because I will, in case I forget to say it, I will show the Atlantic sturgeon with this green box around it. So in case I forget to say, I'm talking about Atlantic sturgeon now. And then the short nose with an orange box around them. But generally speaking, where do they go? So they do have a life history that's somewhat similar to salmon. So they start by spawning in freshwater. So adults migrate into the rivers in May and June, and their annual success varies depending on the water conditions. And I can talk a lot about that, but I want to get to the question about jumping. So early life histories, eggs are spawned in rocky bottoms, and they're in certain temperatures. Juveniles spend between 1 and 4 years in freshwater, and they'll stay in freshwater and not want to be in saltwater at all until they have been able to go through the change to be able to tolerate that. And then spend most of their life in the ocean, migrating, some of them migrating long distances. And then large concentrations of Atlantic sturgeon actually go into the estuaries before they become ready for spawning. So they do spend their time moving between fresh and salt water. And that's the typical Atlantic sturgeon life history as we knew it, as we know it. And for short-nosed sturgeon, when we started studying them and I started working in the Penobscot, they weren't known in the literature, they weren't known to actually go out to the ocean at all. So the literature had shown that they spawn in fresh water, went out kind of to the estuary, and then stayed in fresh water. And they didn't move into salt water. But we quickly found out that that's not the case in Maine. So, and I'll show you some of that, that information in a minute. So in terms of studying sturgeon in Maine, we knew there was a spawning population in the Kennebec. There was a lot of work done by the Maine Department of Marine Resources, some of which is continuing. In the 1990s, there was a study, and then the Edwards Dam was removed in 1999. In the early 2000s, really the status of sturgeon in the Penobscot was unknown, but there was a study done in 1986. They looked for sturgeon in the Penobscot and didn't find any. In 2005, just after I had moved to Maine, a sturgeon was caught in Brewer. And the bridge is actually near where it was caught is shown here. And the person reported it to NOAA, and NOAA contacted UMaine and said, we're not sure they let the fish go. And at the time, the short-nosed sturgeon was listed as endangered and the Atlantic sturgeon was not listed. And so, and the size of the fish that was caught was the size that could have been a big short-nosed sturgeon, but could have been a small Atlantic sturgeon. So there was some concern over, was there another endangered species in the Penobscot other than salmon, at least fish-wise. So we started going out, we got scientific collection permits and started collecting, putting out gill nets to collect sturgeon. We did collect on the Penobscot, both short-nosed and Atlantic sturgeon. And when we captured them, we put these tags in them. And on the map on the right is the Penobscot River. And each of the black dots on here had one of these units that has that number 15 on the block there. And that unit was put in the river at each of those locations. And as a fish that would have one of these tags in it went by, it would collect what the fish was and what time it was. So we could track movements of sturgeon through the Penobscot. So one of the questions I asked at the beginning was, do they migrate? And oh yeah, what we found out is we were tagging fish in the Penobscot, shown here with all these dots, like I showed you before. And the researchers from Department of Marine Resources were studying striped bass in the Kennebec. And so they actually started detecting our fish showing up. So the tags that we were putting in the fish and the Penobscot started showing up in the Kennebec. So that opened up a new area of interest and research. And at the in 2007, the Kennebec Acoustic Receiver Array detected 2 Atlantic sturgeon and 10 short nose that we had tagged in the Penobscot. And similarly, we in the Penobscot captured 2 short-nosed sturgeon that were previously tagged in the Kennebec. So there's clearly something going on with the sturgeon moving between the Kennebec and the Penobscot. So another question, and there's a lot that goes along with that, and I'll show you a few more tidbits about where they go. But another question a lot of people ask are, how big are they? Atlantic sturgeon that we have, and I think this is an Atlantic sturgeon down south. This is not a picture from Maine, but Atlantic sturgeon can reach 800 pounds and be 12 feet long and live for 50 or more years. I've never seen one that big myself, but we have caught some that were quite sizable. And this is a graph, and I'll step through it here. So the blue and the orange are Atlantic sturgeon caught in the Penobscot. And the numbers, the 15 centimeters and 30 centimeters, are the size of the mesh nets that we used. So they're just 2 different types of nets. So what you see is that here we have 200 centimeter long fish. Were the largest Atlantic sturgeon, about 6.5 feet long, that we captured in the Penobscot. Actually, those were captured in the Kennebec. So the Kennebec fish are shown in gray and yellow. And there are some interesting things to see here, is that you kind of have these somewhat smaller, very small fish in the Kennebec, kind of medium-sized fish in the Penobscot, and then very large fish in the Kennebec. And so we're thinking there's these movement patterns. They're in the different river systems for different reasons and different times of the year. Short-nosed sturgeon, on the other hand, are these black bars on the left-hand side. So these are the smaller fish. As I mentioned, they get up, or I may have mentioned, they get up to about 3.5 feet long. So they are smaller than the Atlantic sturgeon. So anyway, so that's how big they get. A little more about where do they go. So the map on the left-hand side is the map of the Penobscot. This was the first dam on the Penobscot that's now since been removed. And then Verona Island is shown here, and then the Penobscot Bay. The graph that you see here is, it's coordinated with the map. So the lines that you see along the graph are where fish were in the river at different times of year. So for example, in July, we found them at this part of the river, roughly speaking. And so what you can see is kind of like this movement upstream, and then they're all in one place in the winter, and then they move downstream, and then they move back upstream again. And this is roughly over a little more than 1.5 years. This is an example. So a couple of things to point out here. This is short-nosed sturgeon. And what we were finding in like October, November, and then again in the spring, is that fish were leaving. So this is kind of indicating those fish that maybe were going to the Kennebec. But also in the winter time, we only had fish in a very small part of the river system. And this is where short-nosed sturgeon winter. They winter in fresh water. So that the short-nosed were staying in the freshwater part of the river. So one of our big questions became, where are these fish going when they're leaving the Penobscot? And I already kind of gave you the punchline with them going to the Kennebec. But interestingly, Gayle Whipplehauser from Department of Marine Resources, and I know this is incredibly busy, but the punchline will be really obvious. Again, this now is the Kennebec River and the Androscoggin River. So we call this Kennebec complex. And what if we just stick with, for instance, this 2010 graphic at the top, I'm going to just point you to this box that says AE, and that's for the Androscoggin estuary. And this line here is indicating a time of year when sturgeon tagged in the Penobscot showed up on spawning grounds in the Androscoggin. So these are spawning ground that is considered spawning grounds right below the Brunswick Dam. And so you'll see that this repeats over in 2011, 2012, and 2013. Sturgeon that we tagged in the Penobscot showed up in the Androscoggin on spawning grounds, as well as in other places, but that's the punchline of this slide. So and I guess I'll also just point out there's this dotted line that shows up as well. Those are short-nosed sturgeon that were tagged in the Saco River, that showed up in the Kennebec. So these graphics really indicate that, and over some time, there were several researchers tagging short-nosed in different river systems in Maine, and they all tended to show up in the Kennebec and on spawning grounds at different times of the year. So this is just to point out that, okay, we tagged them in the Penobscot, they showed up in the Kennebec, but guess what? They went back to the Penobscot too. So there's definitely these movements through saltwater back and forth between these river systems. So roughly speaking, 72% of the fish short-nosed that we tagged in the Penobscot left, and 90% of those that left returned to the Penobscot. So there's something about the Penobscot that was beneficial. And we're still actually studying that today. So where else are they? I mentioned to you that in the winter, in the Penobscot, they tend to be in one location. The picture that you see on the left, it's actually a video if you look carefully. All of these things that look like cord wood are actually sturgeon. So sturgeon in the winter, those that winter in fresh water, they aggregate together and they sit in one location. And there's some suggestion that they are very social during that time, that they follow a leader and they move between different, potentially between different wintering sites. And the picture on the right are wintering short-nosed, an image with a side scan sonar from the Kennebec. So similarly, there are areas of the Kennebec where short-nosed sturgeon come together and stay together for the winter time. So this is different than where Atlantics go. And this is just an example of detections where we've tagged Atlantic sturgeon and they've shown up at these different locations where you see these different bubbles. So we've had tagged Atlantic sturgeon from the Penobscot show up in New York, and as far away as actually the Gulf of St. Lawrence, some of them have been detected. So Atlantic sturgeon tend to go much further. And one of the things that we were looking at, if going back to the Penobscot, what we actually see in terms of winter for Atlantic sturgeon, and these are 5 years of data. This is the similar, like here's the river, and this is for one fish. We have 5 years of data, and you can see where they are along the river. And essentially, instead of them going to one location in the winter that's in the river, Atlantic sturgeon every year leave and go away in the winter time, and we don't know where they go. So they actually go out into the ocean, whereas short-nosed sturgeon go up into the river. And so we've been asking this question for a while: where do Atlantic sturgeon go in the winter? And as I mentioned, some of them have shown up in different locations. Different researchers studying different species, for example, sharks and bluefish and other species, use the same kind of tag system we do. So we've been lucky to have other researchers call us up and say, we have your fish tag code, and it was located at X place at Y time. So we've been lucky to get that information from various different folks along the East Coast. But more recently in 2017, James Sulikowski, who was at the University of New England, tagged some Atlantic sturgeon in the Saco River, which is indicated here. And when he tagged them, we expected they would go pretty far offshore, but essentially all 5 of the fish that he tagged showed up, just left the river system and stayed right off the mouth of the Saco River. So we had this hypothesis that, you know, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe Atlantic sturgeon in our rivers are just going right offshore of the river, river mouth. And so we put some satellite tags on some Atlantic sturgeon captured in the Penobscot and the Kennebec more recently in 2021 to test this hypothesis of where they go, and maybe that they stay off the river mouths. So this is a map I'm showing in the middle of the slide here. The triangles indicate where we tagged sturgeon in both the Penobscot and the Kennebec. And the circles indicate where we actually found those tags after they popped off. So these satellite tags stay on the fish, and after a certain amount of time, we tell them to pop off and come to the surface. So when we tagged them, we said, okay, please pop off in January, February, and March. And so the first tag popped off, and a graduate student actually was able to find it. It's okay if you don't find them, because they actually send data to a satellite and you still get information. But he found it. It was right where the tags from the Saco River ended up, even though it was tagged in the Penobscot. So we thought, okay, maybe they're all showing up off the Saco River. But then I've already given the punchline away here. Different tags showed up at different times all across the Gulf of Maine, essentially. So there is not one place where Atlantic sturgeon go in the Gulf of Maine. That was another hypothesis before we started doing these right off the river examples. And so there's not a single place, there's not an aggregation off river mouths. And Penobscot fish tended to go further than the ones that we tagged out of the Kennebec. So still a question, where do they go in the wintertime? And it's somewhat variable as far as we can tell. Okay, why do sturgeon leap? Curious, I don't know if anybody has access to the chat or has a theory of their own, but I'm happy to share those that I've heard and those that may be a little more plausible than others. Does anybody want to take a shot at saying why they think they jump? Chomping at the bit. Oh, somebody put in a chat. For fun. Showing off to attract a mate for the fun of it. Yeah, so I think that one of the theories is actually to use sound communication to communicate with others. So there's some folks that think, you know, larger fish are going to make a different sound than smaller fish. Or just telling, you know, here I am, I'm over here, come and find me, or I'm over here and leave me alone. So there's some indication that maybe it is for communication. Itchy sea lice, that is one of the other hypotheses, is that they are actually jumping out of the water and trying to hit off parasites off their bodies. And I don't know if there's any evidence of that, but that's one that comes up all the time. And the one of the other ones that's been tested is about adjusting their swim bladder. So sturgeon have a internal bladder that they fill with air so they can adjust where they are in the water column. And their swim bladder is connected to the outside by their mouth. And so actually they can jump, they would need to jump to gulp air to get more air into their swim bladder to change the depth they are in the water column. And so there's been some studies. This is a picture of a sturgeon with what's called an accelerometer on it. And so this tag actually tracks like them jumping out and where they go in the water column afterwards. And they've shown them to actually change where they are in the water column after they've jumped. And the theory is that it's based on the swim bladder volume, the volume of air in their body. And so the other thing, if anybody has actually gone somewhere to watch sturgeon jump, I had a student some time ago who I had sit at a very tidally influenced part of the estuary. So what you'll find is as the tide is actually hitting low, they're actually jumping. They're jumping at that transition because that's where the pressure on their swim bladder is either the most or the least. So you might, if you want to go look for sturgeon jumping, you might go at the beginning or the end of a tide because they have to adjust their swim bladder at those times. So that's the leaning theory, but I think that like the communication and attracting a mate and I don't know, the fun of it is always a good one as well. So some of the biggest threats for sturgeon include entanglement in fishing gear, habitat degradation, for example, dams or just habitats not being available because of dredging or other human influences. And then this, the picture on the far right is actually vessel strikes. So because Atlantic sturgeon are so large and they can be at the surface and large vessels. And this is more a really big issue down in the Delaware and the Hudson rivers. And this picture is taken from down south. But we do have recoveries of Atlantic sturgeon in Maine that have clearly been struck by vessels as well. In terms of natural predators, seals are actually eat sturgeon, and we've seen that happening on the Penobscot. So that's just one example. I don't know if an example of a shark, if I've heard of that, but I can imagine that that could be a possibility as well. So how can you help? I actually have this picture on the right-hand side because I was on Facebook one day and I found this posting where somebody said, I found this thing, and here it is. And so amazingly, this kind of discovery is something that we scientists are super interested in. So for example, the scoots that are on that fish, we could potentially get information from them to say something about their age. And we always try to discover how they've perished to try to look at what are the threats and how can we reduce them. But one of the things in terms of species conservation, it's NOAA Fisheries who wants to be told when anybody finds a sturgeon like this. And so I put this up here and I'm going to put this QR code if anybody wants to take this, and it will be in the slides and available later. But if you take a picture of this code, it will link you to the site where you can actually report sturgeon. Particularly if you find one on the beach, but it's also if anybody catches one, for example, there are people who, I've run into people when I've been shad fishing on the Kennebec who have said that they've caught sturgeon, and anything that we can learn about the size of them or whatever, and having them reported back is helpful in terms of thinking about the management of the species in the river. And with that, I was going to stop and take any questions and go back to anything that anybody wants me to go back to. And thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Gayle. Let me remove the spotlight so we can see other folks. So
stop sharing too.
That would be great. So folks are welcome to put questions in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, you can unmute and ask it. Or if it's a super complicated question, you're welcome to unmute and ask it. Let's see, I'm waiting to see if any questions turn up in the chat box. I'm curious, Gayle, I mean, is it very common for people to catch sturgeon, like fishing in the Androscoggin or elsewhere?
I have run across people, like I said, who either false catch them or and I've heard like a really relatively small fish, but also I don't know if people have heard of this before, but sturgeon jumping in boats. So people have found them like in their boat, you know, after a time that they've mistakenly jumped into a boat. So there's certainly chance of that. And I think, you know, the big thing is you should let it go and make sure it lives. They certainly can't be kept, but making sure they get back in the river, but getting any information on them, like a picture even with your hand next to it for some reference is useful.
Someone's asking, they say several sturgeon populations seem to all decline around 1900. Do you have any ideas about why?
Yeah, that was around the time when a lot of dams were being built and constructed along the East Coast in particular, and other places as well. So that would be my my suggestion on that one. And
what can you tell us about their diet? What do they eat?
Yeah, really fascinating. So I don't know if I showed a good picture of it, but their mouth is underneath. And so that mouth really extends far, and they literally move through the bottom, through the sand, and take out any invertebrates that are there. In the Penobscot, we had done some studies and actually pumped the stomachs of some sturgeon, and they had mostly small worms in them. Amazingly, they were, you know, lots and lots of them, but that's what they were going to the Penobscot to feed on. And we did a little bit of that in the Kennebec as well, and found a slightly different diet than what they were getting in the Penobscot. But it was small invertebrates in the bottom, essentially.
Wow, it's crazy to think that they get that big eating invertebrates.
Yeah, well, I will say also in the Saco River, there was a diet study done, and they were eating sand eels. So there's a little bit of a variety, depending, but we don't get a lot of sand eels in the Penobscot, so it was.
Someone is asking what they eat at different stages in their life cycle, or is it just always, or mostly invertebrates, just different sizes depending on?
Yeah, pretty much. They are not incredibly selective as they're, you know, as they get bigger.
Karen asks, you mentioned sturgeon in the Saco, but I have heard of sightings in the Cousins Island area, near where she lives in Yarmouth. Are they found in other rivers or estuaries than the three you mentioned?
Yes. So they also show up in the Merrimack River. So there's actually a spawning population of short nose in the Merrimack River. They tend to be interesting. They tend to be known to spawn in larger river systems. That said, when we've tagged them in the Penobscot, they kind of we've had record of them dipping into like the St. George and the other rivers along the way. So they do show up in those different locations. And I have heard about the sturgeon showing up around the Cousins as well. So, and I think I even saw somebody's sonar image of them, and they were thinking they were Atlantic sturgeon in there during the winter.
Someone asks, why is it that the sturgeon seem predominantly to end up in the Kennebec, or is that not the case?
You know, some of the indication is that the Kennebec is one of the longer freshwater river access points, especially since the Edwards Dam was removed. And so one of the sturgeon will migrate as far upstream as they can to spawn. And so they'll go as far as the first dam that they hit, essentially, in most rivers in the Gulf of Maine, for example. So the other smaller rivers in between don't tend to have as much of that freshwater habitat, whereas the Kennebec does have like an extensive habitat. And you think about the Saco really doesn't have anything. The Penobscot has now a little bit more, and that's why we're studying the Penobscot, because freshwater habitat was opened up to their historic range in the Penobscot when they removed the dams there.
Are they protected? Are sturgeon protected in other countries, and which countries exploit them the most?
Oh, good question. They are protected at different levels. So even in Canada, there is a small commercial fishery for Atlantic sturgeon in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In the US, I will say, so lake sturgeon are doing better than most of the other sturgeon in the US. And there are some places where lake sturgeon there's a fishery for them. So depending on the species. And trying to think, fishery. So there are very few European sturgeon left. There are some still in Russia, and I'm not familiar with the Chinese or the Japanese current populations. I know the populations in Russia are still being harvested to some extent. But the listing that I mentioned, I would have to go back, but it's like 19 of 27 are on the IUCN list, which is an international list that's like in the endangered species list. So it's a threatened list.
Here's a great question. What is the function of the scutes?
It's thought to be protection. Just like, you know, I always, when I talk with kids about this, I talk about stegosaurs because they have like similar like plates along their back. So it is thought to be a protection for them.
Apparently it doesn't protect them from the seals though.
No.
I can't, I'm having a hard time envisioning. Do seals eat the Atlantic sturgeon also, or mostly the short nose?
Well, the smaller ones, so they could eat the smaller Atlantic sturgeon as they're, you know, growing when they're in freshwater.
Someone says, I'm in a rowing group on the Kennebec, and we frequently see huge sturgeon jumping in the area of Morse Cove. Always amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's it for the question. So if anyone else has a question, get it in the chat box soon. But so to summarize, if you want to see sturgeon jumping, you can do that, for example, below the Brunswick Bridge, but ideally at the as the tide is changing from high to low or low.
Yeah, that's when I would go.
All right. That's great to know. Oh, and Joe Robbins says sturgeon have been seen in Washington County and the Union River in Ellsworth. And there's a sturgeon hatchery in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. Cool.
Yeah. I think that the sturgeon hatchery, they take the sturgeon from the river there and then they grow them up, and then they do, I don't know if Joe wants to unmute, but I think they do sell maybe, I want to say they make products out of it, multiple different products out of the sturgeon that they grow there, including like leather from the skin and other things.
Do you know anything about how the Wabanaki used them?
I believe they were food, for the meat, but I'm not sure like other uses. That's a good question. Like in what they might have used the scutes for example.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think that is it. There were some great questions. Well, thank you so much, Gayle, for I didn't know anything about sturgeon other than that they jump, and now I really want to see them jump. And I'm very jealous of John Lichter who took that incredible picture of the sturgeon jumping right below the dam in Brunswick.
Another good place to see the sturgeon jumping is downtown Augusta near the trestle.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Anyone else want to weigh in with their suggestions of where to see sturgeon jump? And Morse Cove, I guess. All right. Some thank yous in the chat. Thank you so much, Gayle, for sharing your evening with us. Ooh, someone says mouth of the cat ants also.
Oh, there you go.
So I will send a link to the recording and put up a little summary of Gayle's comments. Oh, Gayle, could you send me a copy of your slides so that I can put that into the summary, so if people want to take another look at some of your pics and graphs and stuff, because there was a lot going on in those graphs.
Yeah, I know. Well, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about them more.
Okay, great. I'll put your contact info in.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great evening. Take care.